Welcome back to Book Break. Today we are diving into the fantasy genre, looking at books old and new. Fantasy is pretty much as old as literature itself. Folklore and mythology are fantasy, fairy tales are fantasy, and today there is a whole modern genre of fantasy which has exploded, which is such an exciting way to travel to worlds that aren't quite our own, or to discover worlds hidden in plain sight under the surface of the world that we know. This year we have amazing new books coming out from Macmillan, like Bookshops and Bone Dust, which is the prequel to Legends and Lattes by Travis Baldry, A Power Unbound, which is the final book in the Last Binding series by Freya Marske, and of course the highly anticipated Swordcatcher by Cassandra Clare. And I'm particularly excited that we're actually going to be joined later in this video by Cassandra Clare herself. But as well as telling you about these books, I'm also going to journey through the history of fantasy here at the British Library, where we have been really kindly invited to take a little sneak peek at their new fantasy exhibition before it officially opens. Although by the time you see this, it will now be open, so I will put all the links below so you can come and visit and see for yourself. I can't wait to see what they've got in store for us. Inside, I'm going to be joined by Aisha from the Bookish Panda, who is an incredible fantasy influencer and artist whose work I am obsessed with. I'll also link to her social media platforms below, so you must go and follow her. And we're going to be chatting with one of the curators of this exhibition and learning so much about this wonderful genre. So let's go in. So I'm here with Aisha from the Bookish Panda. Can you tell the viewers a little bit about yourself?
Hi, so I blog about books and I do a bit of cosplay. I make my own little sculptures and I love anything to do with fantasy, especially with a bit of romance.
Her social media is absolutely incredible. I will link to it all below, so do go and check her out. But now we're going to go into the exhibition.
Yes, exciting.
Let's go. Tanya, thank you so much for giving us that tour. We've just had a look around the exhibition and it was really incredible. So some of the parts that I was the most nerding out and excitement over were some of the books. She had some incredible early editions of classic books and even some manuscripts and kind of early scribbles and illustrations, which were amazing. I was especially excited to see any of the books that we published. So we have these lovely collector's editions of lots of classic stories, and all of these I saw featured in there.
Great.
So how did you choose the stories that you featured in there, and why did you think those stories particularly contributed to the fantasy genre?
So we were looking for stories that kind of demonstrated different elements of the genre. Some really classic fairy stories there. So Hans Christian Andersen, obviously, we had to include because his fairy stories have influenced loads of fantasy. But there's kind of more unexpected things. Like, I think people don't necessarily think of Christina Rossetti as a fantasy writer, but Goblin Market is a really amazing long poem that kind of demonstrates the tensions between the human world and the world of fairy, told through this kind of theme of forbidden fruit. It's really amazing, and we've got a really beautiful edition in the exhibition.
Regarding the books, the historical books, so you're looking at The Hobbit, Lord of the Rings, Peter Pan, Hans Christian Andersen, they all feature sort of less detailed maps. Did the actual authors themselves draw the maps?
Quite often, yeah. So Tolkien drew his own map. We've also got, in the exhibition, we've got the original map of Narnia that was drawn by C.S. Lewis. So the version that's in the published book was drawn by his illustrator, Pauline Baynes, who is a much more skilled illustrator. And that's really famous, justifiably so, because it's a really beautiful map. But in order to guide her what to draw, C.S. Lewis did a version that she then used, and that is what we've got in the exhibition. So it's the kind of the preview to what would become the kind of iconic map. And I think the question of like whether you draw the map first or you write the book first and then try and create the map is a really interesting one. I know Terry Pratchett apparently had said that Discworld was impossible to map because he just made it up as he went along. But we have got a map of Discworld in the exhibition that he did work on, so he eventually decided that he could do it. Tolkien was really of the mind that you had to have the map first because otherwise nothing would make sense, and I think that is a more sensible way, but would definitely constrain the imagination for later stories, especially if you're writing a very long saga. So yeah, there's loads of examples where they drew it themselves, and but I think it's a real gift to illustrators, that kind of the fantasy genre, because mapping is such an iconic part of it.
Yeah, any book with a map in the beginning, just know it's going to be great. I was also very excited to see that you had Alice in Wonderland, a little section there. So we at Macmillan are very proud of having been the original publishers of Alice in Wonderland as Macmillan. I brought here just a selection of just some of the different editions that we have published. We have so many.
Yeah.
So from your perspective, having kind of dived into the whole fantasy genre, why has Alice's Adventures in Wonderland endured for so long and keeps capturing the imaginations of so many new generations?
I think it's an amazing story, and it's often thought of as the first children's book that used portals as a kind of way into a different world, and that's been incredibly influential on later literature. So you have all kinds of authors, including C.S. Lewis, Neil Gaiman, Diana Wynne Jones, all talk about portals as a way of kind of travelling between worlds. They have such iconic characters, and I think the illustrations have been really key. So we've got in the library the original manuscript of the book, which was at that point called Alice's Adventures Underground. So before Lewis Carroll had come up with the proper title, he went through loads of different versions. So one of his ideas was Alice's Doings in Elfland, which sounds not good.
I also feel like Alice in Wonderland kind of borders, from being horror to being for children. It's got so many different gothic sort of hints at it, but it sort of allows you to sort of go into that escapism. Like Cheshire Cat is incredibly frightening, but it's sort of funny at the same time. Whenever you see him, you automatically smile, and it's just a weird sensation. And I think that's what it appeals to people, because it has that fairy tale-esque, but it's enjoyable and fun.
Yeah, straddles that line between the kind of happy, exciting dream world and actually being nightmare-inducing horror.
Like, I'd love to see Alice in Wonderland, but horror. I feel like that would be very interesting.
Yeah, terrifying. It's basically there already.
Yeah. You obviously have the influences of the time on the fantasy books. So C.S. Lewis came out, and it was also inspired by, religion, and at the same time J.R. Tolkien came out, and it sort of had a little bit of similarities. What would you say nowadays a lot of fantasy reflects on this day society?
Oh, that's such an interesting question. I think, world building always reflects a bit of your contemporary culture. And I know Tolkien thought C.S. Lewis was mad because his world building in Narnia is all over the place. So it's like a bit of ancient mythology, and then there's the Snow Queen from Hans Christian Andersen, and then there's randomly Father Christmas. It's like, where are you going with this? It's all over the place. Today, I think there's a lot of fantasy taking place in kind of weird urban environments now that reflects a lot of kind of how people live today, and their kind of concerns about living in the city. There's a lot of fantasy that's written from kind of quite progressive perspectives. So, writers like N.K. Jemisin in The City We Became, who's telling the story of the gentrification of New York through this kind of horrific battle where multiculturalism is battling against the kind of homogenizing force of gentrification. So yeah, people are kind of continually using fantasy to talk about the concerns of the day, and as well as calling back these kind of ancient forms of storytelling. I think it's really interesting.
Another bit that I really liked seeing was that you had an incredible early edition of the Iliad, and a nice video from Natalie Haynes, who's one of our authors that we love, and I've got another of our editions of the Iliad here. So for fantasy fans of the modern fantasy genre, do you think that more of them should go back and rediscover Greek mythology and other ancient mythologies from around the world that aren't necessarily kind of thought of as being part of the fantasy genre?
I definitely do, because I think that people will find a lot of the things that they love in those old forms of storytelling, because they modern fantasy literally draws on these, and Natalie Haynes is a really great example that she's kind of rewriting these ancient stories in her own way. The battles are really significant, and lots of fantasy draws on those, and I know a lot of people really love reading the battle scenes in Lord of the Rings. That's all really inspired by this kind of Homeric battle epic. But also it's the idea of the supernatural in it, and the fact that the gods are also battling on a different plane to the mortals, and they've got their favourites, and they want their favourites to be victorious. Yeah, I think there's a lot that people can get from it. They're really fascinating stories. We could have had the Odyssey as well, which is another great adventure story.
Yeah, it really is. It's a lot to love.
Yeah.
As an adult person who reads fantasy, what would you say to someone who tells you, why do you read fantasy? Is it not for children?
Oh, I think that's a really interesting question, because I have definitely had that conversation with people where they've read fantasy as a child and then they've just thought, well, this is silly, not realistic. I want to read about like gritty real life. But I just think that people are really missing out. I think that using your imagination is such an important skill for people. Fantasy is quite often talked about as being a kind of just purely escapist, and there is definitely an element of that. So you can put yourself into a completely different world, forget all of your troubles, and just imagine something different. But it also has this side of like enabling you to see the real world in a different way. So if you compare it to a fantasy world, different things might stick out. You might see things that are unjust that you might not have otherwise realised. You might think about kind of dynamics between people in a different way. And it can just give you a whole new perspective. And I think that they're just missing out on that. And I really hope that people come to the exhibition and realise that actually there's a lot more to fantasy than they might have thought before, and be inspired to read some more.
I think fantasy can also give you a new kind of reimagining of society. So you can still apply things to our real world, but in fantasy, an author has more freedom to kind of ask, what if? What if we didn't do things this way? What if, something people recently, something really great in the fantasy genre is you often get more queer characters, or you get worlds where queer people live completely differently from how our real world might be, and that's really incredible to explore, that you kind of have that freedom of saying, actually, that could work in our world too. If society just changed a bit.
Yeah, it's like facing real life problems, but in a way that doesn't make you feel like you're living in the real world, I guess.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. My final question is just, do you have a favourite part of the exhibition?
Oh, so difficult.
Cruel question.
My colleague who I worked on that with did some filming at the Dragon Meet convention last year, and she asked a number of fantasy fans who were there what fantasy meant to them, and it's like the most moving, beautiful video. So they're all talking about the kind of sense of community that they get, and the belonging, and how they really feel that fantasy helps with their identity. And I just think it's really moving and beautiful, and makes me feel really happy about the exhibition and about the genre and where it's going. So I think that's probably my favourite thing.
Thank you so much. It was really, really fascinating, really great to talk to you about it.
You're welcome.
The links for everything that we've mentioned will be below, so you can come and check it out yourself. Okay, the next incredibly exciting guest that we have today is Cassandra Clare, the author of Swordcatcher that I was talking about earlier. So we have all now had the chance to look around this incredible exhibition. What did you think of it? Do you have any favourite parts?
I loved it. It was so much fun to see a whole British Library exhibit devoted to fantasy, my favorite genre. I had a bunch of favorite parts. I really loved the parts that are dedicated to sort of folklore and fairy tales, because I think those are such important pieces of sort of bedrock of what fantasy is. But also, I also really enjoyed looking at I think it was Robin Hobb's series, like all spread out, so you kind of see the scope of what an epic fantasy story is, and it was just like, I just kept recognizing little pieces of things and being like, oh, Little Big, oh, The Dark is Rising. Like it's such a nice thing to see those books like that get real attention.
Yeah, brilliant. And there's a lot of classic fantasy here. How have some of the books featured here inspired your writing?
I think I saw a book by Ellen Kushner. She wrote a book called Swords Point. I think was one of the first fantasy books I've read that actually has no or very little magic in it, but is all about a imaginary world where there's a nobility that's constantly sort of jostling for power. And it was sort of a predecessor to Game of Thrones, which does have magic and dragons, but again, the main conflict in those on that book is political, and I would also describe Swordcatcher as political fantasy. Like there is some magic, there is, definitely a fantastical element to it, but the real struggle that animates, everybody in the book is the struggle for power.
Amazing, which leads me on. Can you give us a quick summary of Swordcatcher?
I should have practiced like a 15-second Swordcatcher, like a 15-second Hamlet. Swordcatcher is about a young boy who is taken from an orphanage when he's only 10 years old and brought to the palace of the city of Castellane, where he is trained to be the body double of the royal prince, to walk like him, talk like him, look like him, and he stands in for him at all sorts of events at which there might be a danger of assassination so that the prince isn't killed. And then he is approached by the ragpicker king, who is the head of all the criminal enterprises in Castellane, who says to him, if you spy on the royal family and you give me the information, then I can kind of get you out of being a sword catcher. You won't have to have this job anymore. It's really the first time he's ever thought, could I have a different kind of life? And so that really sort of kicks off the events of the book.
Now that you've been to the exhibit, do you have any tinklings of inspiration from any of the exhibits you've seen?
I really like the exhibit on portal fantasy, because I grew up reading a lot of portal fantasy. So, I mean, all of the things that we think of in Narnia, Alice in Wonderland, are all, portal fantasy. And I haven't seen that much of it recently. And so it did give me a stirring for an idea that I've had for a long time about a portal fantasy.
Ooh.
And how I could, sort of play off what we know about portals and how we think that they work.
Okay.
What are you doing here? Go right to it.
Well, all right. Goodbye.
We were talking earlier about people who might not really have read fantasy. That it's kind of a genre a lot of people might either be nervous of or think that they read it as a child and they've grown out of it or something. And we were sort of talking about why we disagree with that. But for someone who wanted to get into fantasy now, what do you have the book that you think they should start with?
Ooh.
Other than, of course, Swordcatcher.
Other than your own books, maybe.
Obviously, you should start with Swordcatcher. Sorry. Goodness, let me think. That's a really interesting question. I think that, one thing that's important for people to keep in mind is that they already do experience a lot of fantasy. If you have watched a Marvel movie about superheroes, if you have watched Star Wars, you have watched fantasy. Those things are fantasy in and of themselves. And I might suggest that they start with, I don't know if I can think of a specific title, but I would suggest they start with contemporary fantasy. So rather than a fantasy that's set in a completely other world where you have to kind of learn, the other world, the maps, the geography, something where there's magic, but it's in our world, I think is a good way to start your fantasy journey.
Yeah, that's great. Really interesting answer. Well, thank you so much. It's been such an honor to meet you.
Honestly, such an honor.
It's lovely to see you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And yeah, Swordcatcher is out now. So that has been such an amazing whistle-stop tour of the fantasy genre, all the way from its origins up to the present day, and in so many different formats as well, from film and TV to gaming to role-play, and most importantly, in my mind, to books. It's really incredible to think that things like the Iliad were an early part of the fantasy genre, and today that genre is thriving perhaps more than ever. And there are so many different subgenres. So going back to these exciting autumn 2023 releases I told you about at the beginning, we see different fantasy genres in here. Bookshops and Bone Dust is cozy fantasy. Power Unbound is a historical romantasy set in a hidden part of our own world. And Swordcatcher is an epic medieval romantasy. And there are so many more out there. There really is a fantasy book for every kind of reader. So I hope you've enjoyed learning a little bit more about fantasy with me today. I will link here to a playlist of all of our other videos about fantasy books. And do leave me a comment letting me know your own favourite fantasy book. And I'll see you next time.